Good afternoon. I'm Chris Barcelos. I'm an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. The title of my talk today is based on a work in progress and is titled The Affective Politics of Care in Transgender Crowdfunding. So like most trans people, my social media feeds are filled with urgent requests from other trans folks to crowdfund their healthcare, housing, and other survival needs. I often find myself scrolling past a seemingly endless collection of crowdfunding campaigns for gender-affirming medical expenses. Even before the COVID crisis, these medical campaigns were interspersed with requests to fund material day-to-day survival needs, food, clothing, shelter, as well as non-material affective needs, such as crowdsourcing the help that we need to navigate the systems that gatekeep the things we need. Scholars have yet to adequately theorize the politics and practice of trans for trans, or what we call T for T crowdfunding. Anecdotally, trans folks know that crowdfunding is an enduring feature of our communities. What the empirical research shows is that crowdfunding is very rarely successful in meeting our needs for surgery, rent, or creative projects. This is true of crowdfunding more generally. So what then does trans crowdfunding accomplish, given that it so rarely fulfills what it says it's trying to do, right? Which is to fund material survival needs. So put another way, what does it actually do for us? So my objective in this paper is to theorize the politics of care in T for T crowdfunding and to analyze its possibilities and limits in terms of trans liberation. In weaving together research on crowdfunding inequalities, cultural artifacts from T for T crowdfunding, and emergent theorizing in trans care, this paper responds to what trans philosopher Gil Malatino calls a dual movement, in wherein we highlight the imperfection and complicity that characterizes contemporary forms of trans care practice as we push for collective redistribution. So alongside Malatino, I'm arguing that we need to interrogate the constraints on trans for trans mutual aid practices, such as crowdfunding, in order to do, as he says, call attention to the epistemologies, systems, and technologies that contribute to such unjust apportioning, even as we must navigate them in order to get some of our needs met. So in short, how does thinking about trans crowdfunding as effective care labor help to understand its utility, even in the face of its failure to redistribute wealth and to meet our needs? I argue that T for T crowdfunding functions as a form of what I call complicit care, a care that simultaneously furthers both our marginalization and our collective liberation. As an individual level solution to structural level problems, crowdfunding as complicit care colludes in maintaining structural violence. Crowdfunding distributes or withholds feelings of care and being cared for that more often than not mirror logics of white supremacy, transnormativity, and neoliberalism. Nonetheless, trans crowdfunding is also care labor in the form of a T for T praxis of love, a small act that makes life more livable in the spaces between now and our collective liberation. So I'm using 4 sites to analyze the affective politics of care in T for T crowdfunding. First is the ubiquitous GoFundMe surgery campaign, where trans people turn to raise money for gender-affirming medical care that's not covered by insurance. Medical crowdfunding is a response to inequalities in healthcare systems, but also serves to reproduce hierarchies of deservingness, and as research has shown, is very rarely financially successful. People very rarely meet their goal or get their needs funded. The next thing I'm looking at is direct cash transfers via apps like Cash App and Venmo. So for example, you'll see things that say urgent in an Instagram story. Black trans femme needs help getting back on her feet. And then there'll be a list of the Venmo, PayPal, Cash App links in the post. So requests are of this sort of very prominent on social media platforms. And for the most part, they're desperate appeals to fund really basic survival needs. Again, food, transportation, housing, clothing, and so on. Nearly all the posts I see on my social media feeds go unfunded, and the majority of comments, like you can see here in this image, are just bumps or trying to skirt the algorithm and get more play for the post. And the third thing I'm thinking about is the outpouring of contributions to Black trans organizations and individuals following the police murder of George Floyd and related uprisings in the summer of 2020. Black trans-led projects and organizations capitalized on this outpouring of solidarity and the not insignificant element of complacent white guilt that may have prompted these donations. For example, the New York City-based organization Glitz, headed by Cayenne Doroshow, pictured here on the top left, raised over $1 million in about a week. And this unprecedented and unexpected outpouring enabled her to purchase an 11-building unit in Queens, New York, which will be a transitional housing program for trans people. And then finally, I'm looking at a holiday project called Trans Santa. Pose star India Moore launched Trans Santa in late 2020. This was a crowdsourced holiday gift-giving project where trans youth under age 24 submitted a hand-drawn wish list, like you can see here on the right, that was then posted to Instagram, and it was linked to a Target registry. And this enabled anyone on the internet to anonymously send gifts to young trans people. By Christmas Day, the project had 935 wish lists. And this really colorful collection that was posted on the Instagram feed really underscored both the need for the project, but also laid bare the conditions of precarity and marginalization faced by trans youth. So there was lots of requests for, like traditional holiday gifts like consumer electronics, but there's also a really overwhelming number of wish lists that asked for basic survival items: food, toiletries, cleaning supplies, other household goods. Looking at this archive in relation to the literature on trans care is one strategy to think through what T4T crowdfunding accomplishes, given that it so infrequently meets our material needs. And even when it does, it's not usually part of a larger sustainable project of trans liberation. So the work in trans care has emerged in response to the need to situate care labor and care ethics outside of cisgender, heteronormative, white, middle-class family formations. In transing and queering the tradition of feminist care ethics, trans care reconfigures what trans philosopher Amy Martin calls a situated trans ethical wisdom of care that links dependency with solidarity in particular communities. At the center of transing care is a desire to imagine a relational praxis of care that cuts across material and affective registers. Focusing on the affective work of T4T crowdfunding highlights what the practice does in trans communities. Thinking about trans crowdfunding as simultaneously an affect, politics, and labor of care helps us to understand its utility, even in the face of its failure to redistribute wealth and to meet our material survival needs. Even in the inability to throw money at these requests that we may see on social media, there's a relational act of commiseration that extends beyond the ability to finance a member of our community's surgery or housing. Nonetheless, we might best think of T4T crowdfunding as a form of complicit care that works both for and against our liberation. As part of an individual level solution to structural level problems, it's complicit in the neoliberal politics that shift the burden of inequality onto marginalized people. And as with crowdfunding more generally, T4T crowdfunding privatizes responsibility for ameliorating the conditions of racial capitalism. As the COVID crisis has made abundantly clear, crowdfunded financial redistribution alone cannot obviate the suffering caused by disaster capitalism and necropolitical state neglect. Naming the complicity of trans crowdfunding doesn't discount the importance of these efforts in terms of their ability to provide effective care and to demonstrate trans political solidarity, but rather highlights that they are much more successful as effective care practices than they are as wealth redistribution efforts. Although trans crowdfunding may perform a relational care ethic, like other forms of caregiving labor, it's nonetheless complicit in the reproduction of gendered inequalities and hierarchies of deservingness. As Nora Kentworthy, an anthropologist of crowdfunding, points out in her analysis of cisgender medical crowdfunding, women are much more likely to take on the feminized caring labor of running crowdfunding campaigns, and this constitutes a new form of digital care labor. Likewise, feminist scholars of affect and digital media have emphasized that feminized, unpaid labor relies on this selfless caring and compassion to serve the needs of capital. And notably in the archive of T4T crowdfunding, we see a lot of trans women and femmes overrepresented in doing this trans digital care labor, as are trans people of color more generally. So trans crowdfunding is not exempt from the burdens of feminized and racialized care labor. So if T4T crowdfunding is a durable, lasting feature of our communities, how might we harness its affective care politics in a way that refuses complicity in structures of domination? Employing a revolutionary etiquette of crowdfunding that emphasizes transparency in the purpose and uses of crowdfunding while maintaining a critique of the need for it in the first place is one such strategy. We must also remain attentive to the tendency for crowdfunding to reproduce gendered and racial inequalities around deservingness and around the uneven distribution of care labor, and then work to remedy them. Recognizing what T4T crowdfunding as effective care labor can and cannot do for us is a related necessary step. There are certainly tangible affective benefits to feeling affirmed and cared for as part of trans community. But without building a shared understanding about why trans folks don't have what they need to survive, and a simultaneous mobilization that builds solidarity through liberation movements, T4T crowdfunding alone remains unlikely to enable us to survive and thrive. And yet, at the same time, it's an important care practice in the space between now and the revolution. Thank you.
My name is Duke Dow, and I'm from the University of Western Australia. I'll be talking about my bisexual activism in the context of theories of love and care. This bell hooks quote sets the scene. Hooks is one of the key and most optimistic and accessible theorists of political and personal love. The quote is a good way to consider how much activism has a goal of liberation and transformation. As she argues in All About Love, all the great movements for social justice in our society have strongly emphasized a love ethic. A bit about myself. I am, among other things, a woman of color, a bisexual, queer scholar of romantic love and religious eroticism, among other things. I've always been interested in love. My PhD was on mutual love and reciprocal touch in the poetry of the 19th century poet and Jesuit Gerard Manley Hopkins. I argued that Hopkins's conversion was one of his most romantic acts and that we should read his work in this light. I also held a postdoc on the reception of the biblical book, The Song of Songs, which I argue is the biblical book about love. But right now I want to move beyond social constructions of romantic love to talk about politicized love that's more in keeping with feminist and intersectional frameworks. My most recent research has been shifting away from literary studies towards social research and social justice research. It reflects my stronger shift towards LGBTIQA+ and bisexual activism. In brief, what's helped me make that leap was an early career keynote lecture that I presented on womanist theology and the Song of Songs, and the subsequent essay, which is forthcoming in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Religion, Gender and Sexuality. Womanist theology's emphasis on the Bible's application to broader social issues has been a way of making the Bible relevant to the experience of contemporary African-American women. Specifically, womanist theologians read the Song of Songs to resist oppression and to nurture what might be called love politics, social justice embedded in a resistant ethic of self-care and self-love, which are themselves acts of defiance in a society which is full of racism against Black women in particular. In my research, I want to talk about bi+ activism in terms of a broader discussion of love by resituating it in the history of LGBTIQA+ activism, where it is seen at best as an anomaly and at worst as non-existent in the beginnings of gay and lesbian liberation in particular. This current paper forms the basis of an article for a special edition of a queer journal on the theme of queer generosity. With this paper, I aim to reflect ethnographically on my bisexuality and my bisexual activism as an act of queer generosity. Specifically, I claim for bi activism a place in the history of social activism as a form of care and love. Australian social work academic Naomi Joy Godden looks to the work of bell hooks to espouse a love ethic, which covers dialogue, non-violence, interconnectedness between people and nature, and shared power and solidarity. For Hooks, an ethic of love is a practice we deliberately choose so that we take responsibility for our actions. Our claims of loving must be backed up by appropriate acts of love, in other words. For Hooks, love is a verb, an ethical, practice-based way of being with others. Through Hooks, Godden highlights the potential of love-based social work as activism for structural transformation, such as challenging systems of neoliberal capitalism, patriarchy, racism, and environmental exploitation. Hooks' theory informs what Godden calls relationship-oriented activism, which recognises the self in the other and commits to transforming systems of inequality through collective activism. When I first read Godden's article, I was struck by how much it resonated with me, as social work is a values and action-based profession that, at a macro level, advocates changes to systems of inequality and injustice, and at a micro level, supports human rights, welfare, and dignity through relationships between social workers, clients, and communities. In many ways, my activism, including my bi activism, seeks similar social and relational changes. In this framework, love might be framed as compassion and caring, as distinct from liking. For Hooks, it is participatory emotion, prompted by feeling, but moving towards practice. Hence, several years ago, I would say that I was moved to set up a peer-run bi group at my university after reading enough about the mental health effects of biphobia, stereotypes, erasure, and lack of belonging. I'll have some stats on the next slide. As I imagined it, this group of bi+ students, staff, and alumni would have a strong peer support and social aspect on Facebook and in person, relying on the interpersonal relationship between peers to build community and belonging. Running these groups is not without its challenges, as I have outlined elsewhere, but as I move away from university-based activism, my time and attention has shifted towards a larger bi+ group that I began to run a couple of years later, and through which I engage in more obvious forms of social activism, in addition to the interpersonal relationships with peers. I won't have as much time to talk about the activism as much as what we do online, but in our discussion, we can talk more about what I do outside of the online context. Very little has been written about bi+ activism or the role of bi+ activists in the history of broader gay and lesbian activism and liberation, despite bi+ people being the largest group in the LGBTIQA+ alphabet soup. Last year, I co-authored an article
with one of the coordinators of Bi Plus Community Perth, which we both run. Our aim in the article is to explore Bi Plus invisibility and erasure, and the need for Bi Plus activism, and to discuss the work that we do at Bi Plus Community Perth in order to address these issues. Ultimately, Bi Plus activism is focused on transformation and on change to benefit the Bi Plus community. We included quotes from members and spoke of our own experiences in running the group. We have been able to create a sense of community with this group that for many Bi Plus people had been missing until then. And we see this group within the history of Bi Plus activism, which we wanted to honour. I added the final dot point on this slide about consensual non-monogamy and polyamory because it reminds me of how Bi Plus people might bring an expansive definition of love to our lives and to our activism. Sometimes we say we care for you as either a substitute for or as a weakened form of I love you. But for me, increasingly, I am seeing love as being synonymous with care and vice versa. What plays a role in that is my initial misunderstanding, I have to admit. My misunderstanding that care is related to charity, which is from the Latin word caritas, love or love. And this refers to the reciprocal love between God and humans and the unselfish love of others. But moving on from my misunderstanding, Paul Byron, in talking about digitally mediated practices of peer support and friendship, argues that care contours everyday digital and social media use. These informal care practices are everyday practices of care that circulate beyond professional and familial spaces that are particularly common to friendships and communities of shared interests. Bi Plus Community Perth Facebook group is one such community of shared interests and includes some friendships as well. Byron believes that we should study and support these spaces of digital intimacies and cultures of care because they increasingly influence our health and well-being, and I agree with him. These spaces offer affective and public spaces of intimacy. With a Facebook group, we aim to provide a safe space for Bi Plus people to ask for support and advice on relationships, on coming out and sexuality, and on romantic and sexual practices. It's a space where some can bring their otherwise closeted selves into the digital company of other Bi Plus people, and where members can express their bisexuality with or bi-romantic selves and interact with their peers. The page offers an archive or witness as well to the practice of care, as posts often lead to threads where members take the time and care to respond with affirmative and supportive messages and advice to original posters and other members. This can result in a sense of solidarity through the openness of sharing experiences and vulnerabilities. And just very briefly, I'm still considering if radical care is something that fits into the paper. I've left some points in there for consideration, especially given the continued access to community that we have offered during COVID-19. And this is my final slide. Power differentials and complexity around love is a final thing to consider. Love is not always a bed of roses, and thinking about who loves and is being loved and who is able to love, what kind of love, and is love always a positive or benevolent force? These questions have been posed by Sarah Ahmed, Eleanor Wilkinson and others, and indeed other considerations need to be taken into account, such as emotional labour, along with gendered and racialised aspects of care. Moreover, Byron acknowledges that Australian academia, including his own research, takes its culture from European systems of imperialist knowledge that are built upon the destruction of Indigenous ways of knowing and caring about place and each other. Relatedly, we have been wondering about how we might reach out more actively to First Nations people in our group and acknowledge their ways of knowing and caring. Hart and Negri's political concept of love in their book Commonwealth appeals to me on a number of levels, especially their idea that love harnesses singularities
as a network of social relations into participating in the common. However, the book has been critiqued by a number of feminists. These include scholars engaged in feminist love studies. Feminist love studies is a diverse field, and while love studies includes theorists on the left and the right, feminist love studies, as outlined by Anne Ferguson, is materialist feminist because it assumes that social power relations are built around meeting life needs related to the body, such as material needs, but also social needs for love, affection, sexual connection, and a sense of belonging in relation to social groups. A sense of belonging in relation to social groups in particular is what we strive for in Bi Plus Community Perth. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night, depend where you in this moment. We want to thank the organizers for giving us the possibility to share with you our presentation, and thank you for share this presentation with us. Our paper called "To Fit Care Practice Between Love and Hope." The theoretical and empirical framework started with a long research about 4 topics: emotions, social policy, eating practice, political sensibility. In the context of the inquiry about social policy, labor, the new form to make city and so on. But this presentation, we want to show you is in the context of the one case about sociology of emotion and body emotion. For us, it's a connection between body and emotion. It's a dialectical connection. There are many forms to observe and to live body, and there are many models to connect feelings, emotion, and sensation. One of these is take the politic of sensibility like a mark of society, like a scanner of social practice. For like a result of these researches from all the last years, we find out this trinity of neo-colonial religion. We call this with 3 characteristics: mimetic consumption, diminished humanitarianism or faith solidarism, and resignation. But this neo-colonial religion have another side, have the opposite side, constituted by hope, love, and reciprocity. In this context, we emphasize the interstitial practice. What mean interstitial practice? They are the disruption of normativity. The society that live in normal form of consumption, this kind of immediate enjoyment through the consumption, this kind of the colonialism of inner planet and the external planet, we find out this kind of the interstitial practice that are the response to the political economy of morality of capitalism in a planetary scale. The interstitial practice are fall, Brexit, unexpected practice. In this context, we want to show you in this presentation our findings about the connection between eating practice, social organization in Latin America in the context of the pandemic and the last year. The next step of our presentation show you our colleague Aldana.
Well, we understand care as a set of practices for biological, daily, and social reproduction. The management of these practices requires specific organization of resources, services, and actions that make it possible for food, health, and personal hygiene, and also the management and emotional care associated with care itself. Eating practices are a very important part of care since they require specific daily tasks and organizations such as food practices and commensality practices, and multiple activities in relation to what to eat, nutrition, and time management. In this sense, it is important to say that eating practices will be framed within the social relations that constitute them, and there are a space of class bodies that will give rise to food practices carried out through taste and choice, and to shape those bodies as their main consequence. In this research, the principal objective was to analyze the emotion associated with food in soup kitchen, as a care practices that is configured and as an interstitial practices and an affirmation of love and hope. We did a digital ethnography about the organization of the soup kitchens in Latin America and the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, Argentina, during the second semester in 2020. The platform chosen to observe and do the digital ethnography was Instagram, because this platform became more popular as a new way of showing the work at the soup kitchen. We are able to assess soup kitchens' Instagram profiles in different countries of Latin America, and we realized that there were all similar in the photos and its emotion they show. The most striking feature is the act of giving food, and in this way, it is highly significant to show the picture with the food. In them, we can see how much food people are given instead of just a few cans or packets of rice. The pictures always convey a grateful atmosphere. People are grateful for the help of others, so they create a change with help. In this way, the publication shows how much food or how many plates of food they had given. No matter how little the help, it will surely mean more food to give. The change of help is multiplicity.
Communitarian and popular soup kitchens and emphatic awareness. Social organizations, proximity, demand, and openness. State crisis, overflow of civil society and formalization of aid. Cascade of donation, shared precariousness, and naturalized resignation. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in Latin America, an overload of the institutional systems of assistance, aid, and community work is evident. The state, civil society, and the channels of social responsibility are overwhelmed. There is a tsunami of demands. Social organizations are transformed into spaces of proximity where people come to express their needs, into vehicles of common energy and instruments for expand knowledge of demands, wants, and needs. Three phenomena become evident that although they existed before the pandemic, have been emphasized throughout the region at the same time. A. Cascade of donations. Those who have give to those who have less. This in turn give to those who have less than lay, and this in turn help others with what they can. B. Naturalization of resignation versus hopeful energy in terms of, in spite of everything, I am not alone. C. Sharing precariousness versus power of community love in terms of making injustice situation a common problem. In this digital ethnography, it is possible to see another phase of care as a emphatic consciousness, based on love, common energy, and hope as a practice that makes the future. Hope and love become an energy, as a motivation, as a cause, and as a practice.